John Vest is the Extension Agent for Floyd County with the Virginia Cooperative Extension. His expertise helps novice and experienced farmers produce quality livestock and crops throughout our region. John has offered to share his experiences with our audience and provide them with the knowledge to keep agriculture strong. This is the Ag Show with John Vest.
We'd like to welcome our outside guests that will be tuning in for this episode of the Ag Show, brought to you by Citizens Telephone Cooperative and Virginia Cooperative Extension. I'm John Vest, and this will be our segment on soils.
This episode of the Ag Show and the Seed to Shelf series is brought to you by We Insure Retirement. If you are retired or are planning to retire, visit WeInsureRetirement.com to keep the gold in your golden years.
Well, I'm John Vest. I welcome everyone here tonight, including our viewers on television. We're going to be taping this evening in addition for the Ag Show, brought to you by Citizens Telephone Cooperative and your Virginia Cooperative Extension office. So welcome everybody here tonight. We're going to have I think, an interesting and enjoyable evening because I'm going to make the audience participatory tonight. So we're going to ask some questions of you as we go through, maybe tackle some of your problem garden insects or disease, or maybe discuss those options that are available to all of us, so that if we have something to work for you, it most likely will work for everyone in this room. If we can relay that, we've accomplished something tonight. So once again, welcome everybody to Seed and Shelf this Thursday evening. And we'll go ahead and get started and move right in. First of all, like I said, I'm John Vest, the Ag Agent here in Floyd County, your Ag Agent, and I wanted to give credit where credit is due. My Ag Agent over in Montgomery County, our new agent, Miss Meredith Hoggett, she's been there for a couple of years now, but her background, all agents have different specialty areas that we really progressed through school with and the like, and mine was horticulture and production ag on the growing side. Meredith had a strong entomology background, so she's the natural, or one of the natural agents to possibly look to for questions when I don't know an insect, to possibly approach her with the question. And or, as always, when it comes to your land-grant universities, Virginia Tech and Virginia State, you as citizens of your county can bring at any time a insect problem in, or if you've collected samples and things, you can bring them to your extension office for your agents to make an effort to identify and offer suggestion and control or remediation. Or if we don't know and we can't call on an agent next door to help us out, we might boot it right on up to Virginia Tech, where at the pathology department or the entomology department and stuff, we are set up there to take samples and address your pest needs when it comes to growing just about anything. So tonight, Meredith is responsible for developing this presentation. I'm going to take you through it because it's pertinent information for all of us to understand. And the reason we've actually stuck these first 4 or 5 slides in is, and we're talking about the connection before content. Every one of us are here for a reason tonight. It's to learn something. We want to learn a little bit about what connects us to our interests or our concerns. So we've got 4 or so slides right here that I'd like to beg the answers from you with regards to these questions of each of you. What could you actually, in this particular case, if you had your choice of one to be free of one of these pests for the rest of your gardening careers, which one would be of biggest interest or largest interest to you? Would it be the disease issues? Okay. Disease. B for the insects. Any others? The furry critters. Well, the reason this slide is actually up there is because we all have to recognize there's those best conditions, those windows of opportunity, like I like to use, that contribute to each one of these problems. Now, when you ask Virginia Tech about the hungry animals, encroaching on the gardens and eating things away and how they go about things, we're going to preach exclusion, okay? So fencing and mechanical or cultural efforts, things that you and I can do to exclude those animals and things from the garden. So that's a fairly simple process. I mean, it may be expensive, but at least it's a simple process. In the case of the two center ones, the insect and the disease, those are two that really start to become difficult for us because they are reliant upon Mother Nature, wet seasons, ideal temperatures, the creation of the disease or the disease window of opportunity for all kinds of factors to be in play to create an ideal disease outbreak. And that also affects, in large degrees, your insect presence as well. For instance, squash bugs, and we'll talk about this here a little later in the presentation, just the sheer fact that this is winter 2, that we've gone through and haven't seen a significant amount, we actually could have those squash bugs that will make it through, that have made it through mature-wise through our winter this year, and we'll be ready to go right off the bat, much earlier in the season than what we've had previous years. So there are those insects that have that ability to make it through things or make it through those windows if we leave them open. And lastly, the weeds. And as mentioned, kind of like with the grasses there on the back table that we were identifying a little while ago, in most cases, we can deal with weeds from a mechanical perspective, from a spray perspective. There's lots of things that we can do to eliminate a seed bank. And once I get down to where things have been eliminated, their reintroduction isn't going to be willy-nilly like the weather and the other things that contribute to the others. They're not just going to fly in, unless that bird brings the autumn olive into the garden. But for the most part, I would agree. The weeds and the weeds and the furry critters are by far the easiest two, in my opinion, to deal with. If I had to ask you what's your favorite vegetable as a kid? Any suggestions? They don't have to be the 4 up there. Anybody have a particular interest? What gets you out in the garden? Lima beans. So for example there, if I know I'm a lima bean fan, and I know that in the back of my mind, want to grow healthy legumes in general, and they want to be deep-rooted and have a higher pH than normal. All these things start to form in the back of my mind to reduce the pest activity and disease occurrence that can occur in those beans throughout my season. I absolutely, in every case, want to start paying attention to, in the case of beans, those diseases that I saw maybe last year, or even maybe a hint of disease the year before. I would be on alert for this year to see about their progression, because what we tend to see in all of our garden locations is a buildup of either disease inoculum that's going to be present the upcoming year, and or insect eggs and things like that will move in as well. So depending on whatever your favorite vegetable might be and got your interest with regards to gardening, there's where you need to start backing up and thinking, hey, this is what I grow yearly. What are the things that I see yearly that are pests in my lawn or landscape or my garden? If I had to ask each one of you in here, what is your number one garden pest? And if the reason we're asking this is because in case it's not part of my slide presentation this evening, we're going to have that conversation as to what it is, because Extension has a publication. It has an explanation of life cycle of whatever it may be, from weed to insect to whatever that pest is. We typically have a explanation of how to deal with that particular situation. So I'm going to go real quickly through the room just so I can hear and see if I've left anything out, and we'll go ding ding, write that down or remind me as we go through, and we're going to deal with your particular pest. So starting up here again,
Cutworms and grubs.
cutworms and grubs, okay. Squash bugs. Tomato hornworm. So far we're covered some good. The cutworms I haven't, but I know how to fix that. Go ahead. Japanese beetles, all righty. Ants and aphids. That's wonderful because you've just segued right into the beginning of this presentation. Because a lot of us are dealing, anytime we're digging the soil, there's actually 5 different potential grub worms. All your May beetle, June beetle, Japanese beetle, Rose Schaefer, all those are grub worms in our soils here in Southwest Virginia. So they, in any case, are looking for plant root systems to feed off of. So we'll go over some of that discussion there. As far as tonight, what I'd like to get us through is a brief discussion just about the transplanting and planting of some of your garden varieties, just to remember some important tidbits of information there. Then we're going to jump into IPM. Does anybody know what IPM is? Integrated Pest Management. It's the toolbox. It's all the things that I would love to do or utilize before I grab that expensive chemical spray or that toxic chemical spray or whatever it may be. Before I make the choice to use a chemical in a garden that I want to eat out of, I'm going to go through the process of all those other tools that are available to me to address the problem. So we'll have a conversation about those as well. We're going to talk and see pictures about the common diseases and insects that we have here in Floyd and Montgomery counties. We're also going to talk about attracting natural enemies and maybe some things that you and I can do in one portion of the garden or maybe between 2 garden areas to increase our natural enemies to come and feed on some of these pest insects. And lastly, we'll talk about that proactive planting so that we make sure our limas look and harvest absolutely wonderful beans year after year after year. So starting right off, want to remind everybody that our season certainly has set itself up this year once again for failure, only from the standpoint that our last frost date here in Floyd and Meadowsden, and because of our elevations in many cases, our last frost date is labeled as May the 15th. I've mentioned before that probably 4 out of the last 6 years I can show you killing frosts that have occurred between the 19th and the 21st of the month of May. So we're not out of the woods yet. Even though graduation, everything's minds are set on different things right now, the fact of the matter is, if you've got your tomatoes out and you've got your other things out that aren't necessarily cold hardy, you got to be prepared at any time to get in there and intervene. That being said, frost date, once again, is a big thing in our area, and I would just encourage you, if you're above 1,800 feet in elevation and you're anywhere in the New River Valley Plateau and stuff, really think about gardens as a post, 3rd week in May, getting things out. Unless it's your cool season, varieties and things that can tolerate a light frost and those situations. When it comes to all those things, you drive through Floyd right now, you start on one side of the county, I've got greenhouses and nursery, you start on the other side of the county, I've got other greenhouses and every store in between has got something green hanging from the rafters and beautiful flower show and all the like. It's so tempting to go out there and start deciding on what we want, and then they do one other thing. They throw Mother's Day right to smack dab. And I even told kindergartners just last week, all of you need to go home and remind your dads that Mother's Day is coming up and you want to be back here buying them their flowers. So in terms of all those things that we see out, much of that green that you do see on the plant stands and on the shelves are those vegetable transplants or our garden variety transplants that have been grown in the greenhouse. They've been shipped out to their retail locations, and now it's up to you and I to jump in there and decide our purchase. That being said, once you've pulled those off the shelf, paid for them, and put them in the back seat of the car and have headed home, you need to start thinking about what my hardening off or transplant procedure is going to be. In fact, one of the good things to do, because you don't know how long that young plant has been there amongst the others or what other plants have been moved in beside it, first thing I'd do before I actually went to the garden with it would be hold up that tray and kind of look around and see what my situation is for disease carryover. Maybe it's one plant that looks bad out of a bunch. Why would I plant the one sickly one amongst all my beautiful looking others? Or I'm looking for the insects that, if we have even a small hand lens, just a 10x hand lens, in many cases that will show us the multitude of spring garden insects that might be actually on our plant. For instance, once again, as we start in those 70-degree temperatures, 70-degree weeks, that's when all this insect activity, that's when your aphids go, woohoo, we're going to go reproduce. And then every individual insect has that capability of producing 200 more in 6 days. So there is where, as you're making your selection and pulling your transplants in, before they go into your greenhouse or go into wherever you're going to store them until they get to the garden, do make the effort to look closely and examine. Be your scout, be that monitor before you put someone else's problem, pest, into your growing situation. When it comes to acclimating those plants, hopefully most of them have been moved outdoors and are on these stoops and outside the stores and things, and have gotten a dose of acclimation to normal weather here in the past weeks that they've been out. But in some cases, they've just rolled off the truck right out of the greenhouse and are subject to, being put out on that hot concrete and or subject to a cold night. They might not fare as well. So in terms of hardening things off, just realize that a few days, even down to 3 days, that you buy that plant in kind of in a transition zone, if you could provide that plant protection from a direct western exposure and a high heat situation. Maybe it's just a scattered shade or just the top of a carport to give it some shade, but acclimate itself to our temperatures will go a long way in getting that plant prepared to move out and into the garden. The next thing we want to be doing when it comes to the transplants is deciding and paying attention to the weather channel. Now, not to pick on my meteorologist friends, but of all the jobs to have where you can be wrong half the time and still, do your job the next day. I'm just picking on folks, don't get mad at me. The fact of the matter is, all of us as gardeners, though, before we move our transplants out and look at transplanting things out into the garden, we do want to try to see what those weather conditions are bringing towards us with regards to amount of water, moisture, and those temperatures and things that could be detrimental to a young, tender transplant that has just been placed out in the soil. And what I'm trying to explain there is, if we could find a cloudy day, or maybe a window of opportunity once again, where you have the cloudy or the overcast days, those are wonderful days to think about being out there in the garden and transplanting the bulk of your plant material in. Largely because that's, once again, that western exposure or the high temperature exposure of sunlight from around 2 o'clock in the afternoon isn't baking that young plant into oblivion out there in its new soil location. It hasn't had a chance to reach out or spread its root system or really grow out in the soil yet, where it can take up water and really establish its turgor pressure and everything once again just yet. So it's basically a very susceptible young plant to that kind of condition. So look for in your meteorological window of opportunity, hopefully the next cloudy event, or maybe it's going to be cloudy leading up to a rain event that's going to water everything down. And pay attention to that as a transplant opportunity. The other big thing is, I would say, is don't transplant into dry soil. All these transplants are packaged in our soil medias and our soilless medias and things that we've talked about with the peat and the other material there to hold water. And if I plant that into dry soil, what I typically end up with is soil that wicks the water away from everything around that young plant base. So by all means, take the time to it may be the day before, go out there and set a sprinkler, water a hose. I don't care if you carry water down the road. but do something to add some water, weten the soil, dampen that soil prior to your actual transplant plant operation, and your transplants will love you for it. Lastly, when it comes to leaving them out, like I said, 3 days to 7 days, 10 days, what's a good time? That's largely dependent on how soon or how young that plant is that I've seen come in that flat. I will say the younger or more tender the plant, the longer the transition should be before I move it out. And you'll be in a much safer situation. But 3 to 5 days is a wonderful window to operate out of. Just like I mentioned, when it comes to the cloudiness of the forecast and the potential for a late afternoon thunderstorm or at least a light drenching rain, future precipitation, all of those things will make us successful or add to the potential successfulness of our planting. When it comes to, actually now we found that perfect window of opportunity. The weatherman says, oh, it's going to be overcast today. We're going to roll out there and get started. Think about how and where you're going to be placing these plants in your garden rows. I will say I want to accomplish the same thing while those plants are in those flats or in those containers. I want to water them in that morning and make sure they're fully watered before I go placing them out in the garden. I want to have their soil absorb up all it can before I make the transplant procedure. That being said, it's twofold. It's not just for the water, but it's there to hold that root ball and prevent that soil from falling away or dropping away and disturbing that root presence. So that's a big important thing when it comes to transplanting, is I want to dig a hole that's large enough for my base of my plant, and usually no larger. I don't like to I don't like to bury a plant deep unless it's a tomato. But in most cases, I'm just really planting things back down to the original soil level. But in every case, I want to do as little root disruption as I can get away with. Now, if I have something that's root bound and roots are already out there and everything, certainly there's nothing wrong with doing a little disturbance there to encourage them to grow out in their new soil location. But for the most part, if I've watered things well, my transplant pulls up and out of the pot, and I can drop things in, press my soil back in. Airspace is a killer in transplants. So if you've dug your hole or used whatever tool to remove the soil out of your planting hole, as your young transplant goes back in, don't just push the soil up around the top and not knead it in around the root system. If you're leaving air pockets in there, that root grows out into an airspace. In many cases, it can dry and die right there within the airspace. So it's important to make sure you have root, stem, soil contact with your plant. For those of us with tomatoes in the ground already, just picking, do be prepared for the potential for those storms or those weather conditions that might create a problem for us. So hopefully you've got some baskets or something that will go over or have a protective device in many cases. Water walls, coffee cans, I don't care what it might be, all do offer usually for, a protective layer from that of a moderate frost. So in many cases, I can actually end up in a frost or freeze situation, maybe as low as about 30, 28 degrees, somewhere in there. As long as I've covered with some type of protective device, I'm still protected. So when we get into a freeze, it gets on down about 26 degrees, then I really probably haven't been able to put enough material over to really protect my young transplant. Pay attention if that weather forecast said that the rain was due to be there, but then didn't arrive, like it does right through this area of Floyd County. It splits on us, and we watch Franklin Steel on that side, and we watch another section of steel over here. That's when you need to be out there making sure that you can maintain your soil, water, and everything out to that point. We don't want the water being wicked away from our young plants. Part of all this and this effort is to start trying to reduce the chances from those abiotic situations or those those situations that are not truly insect or not truly disease or not, these are the plant pest problems or the plant problems. They're not really pest oriented as much as they are human oriented. And by doing these things that I'm suggesting to you, keeping that turtle pressure up and the water pressure up in that young plant and stuff, those things will actually help reduce, in many cases, or improve its survivability when you end up in a situation where Mother Nature takes a turn. The big one and the most important one with regards to that transition timing is the sun scald and that tension. It's basically sunburning those young plant leaves, just like you or I would get a sunburn, except instead of turning red like we do, they turn white. And as that water or moisture, maybe we tried to get out there and diligently water, and that water was laying on that leaf surface, and 2 o'clock rolled around that afternoon, and the sun popped out and baked things good. I'll get samples brought in, and I say, oh, I've got some kind of disease, something's really going on here, whatever. Actually, no, that's an unfortunate situation of sun scald or sunburn on our young plants. And just a large way of fixing that is getting that 3 to 5 days of transition before it goes out into the 12 hours, 14 hours of the heat of the day, like what we'd like our gardens to be in. In terms of yellowing of leaves, I will remind most folks, all these transplants have gotten the best of the best while they've been in the greenhouse. It's not our interest to try to sell you yellow plants and think that you're going to want to buy from us next year. So you're going to have wonderfully dark green type plants and transplants that we've fed the calcium, we've fed the magnesium, and we've done the tricks of the trade to really make them inviting. And as you've put them out in their soil, the new soil location, they've used up in the next 6 to 10 days the nutrients that are in their system. And so we'll start to see some light yellowing, or you'll certainly see a color change. It might be a lighter green, it might be certainly a color difference, but those are things that if we're going through that transplant process properly, hopefully our fertilizer and things that we'll add as we go along will fix things. The wilting and the failure to grow is usually due to transplant shock in young material. Now yes, aphids feeding on the growing points of anything new and green out there can certainly be sapping the strength as they suck the juice out of that plant. And it will certainly create a wilt in many cases. But the wilts that we typically see are where that plant is either too deep or too shallow with how it's been planted. Its crown may be too high. Its root system never had a soil firmed around it. And the wilts that we see may not be pest oriented at all. So I just want to remind you that that's part of the reason for this process. And then in the failure to grow category, we oftentimes don't realize that something as little as a single frosted evening or an excessive water event, the plant may tolerate it one time, but in many cases, a second major rain event that dumps an inch and a half of water in our garden the very next day is enough to actually stop that plant or create a situation where your transplants may not recover from being smothered in the water content. So it's recognizing that something just as simple as an afternoon thunderstorm on day 1 that was repeated on day 2 and maybe day 4, and then a week later, why are my tomatoes, they're just not growing, there's something sickly about them, or they're just not growing. It could have actually been the problem was created in that initial weather event that we experienced. So it's just important to recognize, I guess, the differences between true pests, insects and disease, and some of these physiological responses that plants can have. Now when it comes to IPM, this is what's going to buy us all the opportunity, everyone in here, that opportunity to rid ourselves of the insects and the disease and those 2 middle ones that we talked about, and really achieve, hopefully, a successful garden season. Now, I've mentioned IPM to me is my toolbox. It's all those various circles up there that enable me to be successful before I grab down there, let's see here, up here in the top number at 11 o'clock, before I grab that chemical, I usually want to have made sure I've accomplished a few of these anyway. First, host plant resistance. When I'm choosing those transplants or choosing those young plants or the seed that I'm choosing to use, I want to make sure it's virus-free, it's verticillium resistant, it's fusarium resistant, the root rots that typically occur naturally in our area. I want them to have some resistance to those problems already. And you can't, most seed and seed companies are very diligent in making sure that they are supplying you the material that can do just that. But two, from a cultural perspective, those are things that you and I can certainly do. If I know this garden has been gardened for a number of years, is really showing a lot of pest problems, or I experienced a really rough year the year prior, maybe it's time to up and move that garden over to a new location, and just by crop rotation, taking myself out of a bad situation, such as the cutworms. Actually, and let's tackle cutworms just real quick. Unfortunately for the cutworms and the wireworms in the garden situations, I oftentimes see that in our transition to new locations. And that's where these insects typically live and function very well in turf and high grass and forage areas, and are never recognized for their presence. But once we work the soil up and work a new garden location, because I wanted to get my potatoes in a new spot, suddenly the wireworms, the cutworms, and everything that were there in the grass certainly make their presence known in the garden. So it's recognizing that just because I'm moving to a new location doesn't necessarily mean that that new location won't have certain situations that arise or contribute to problems starting out. And the cutworms and the wireworms are two things I see readily when I move to a new garden location for the first time or the first year or so. I want to talk about being proactive as we go through all these, so I'm going to try to give you examples as we go, though. The whole thing here with IPM is to reduce our environmental risk, our use of pesticides. Number one, it's too costly to go out there and be buying all this chemical any longer without seeing some benefit. But the real reason for me for IPM is that, and this is in the data and the facts out there, nearly 90% of our insecticidal applications for the insect pests on that list do no good at all for us, because we are not applying the product at the right time, at the period in life cycle, or understanding how it's going to work on that particular pest to benefit us. So 90-some% of this, it's greater than 90 actually, greater than 90% of the time the insecticides sold in the United States do little to no work at all. So we're going to tackle those as far as we go through here. But I don't like to eat chemical, and I certainly would encourage all of us to use a minimal chemical approach by tackling those things that we can, in IPM or in our toolbox, that we can do first. Starting off, that's identifying, just like what you've come here tonight to do, and that's to identify your pests and recognize hopefully their life cycles and things, and why they can be problematic. Now, at the risk of, for my camera audience or my TV audience, Dawn, can we maybe cut the light here just to see? I want these to show up well, and that one light's kind of fuzzing things out. Does that work for everybody there? It is absolutely important for any of us to understand what our insect presence is, or what that insect pest is that's creating the problem. Because my selection on how to deal with this insect right here will actually create a situation where mites and my little 8-legged arachnids come and creates a worse problem for them, after my application. So when it comes to identifying our insects or identifying our disease, just like you've done tonight, picture out, let's take a look, that hand lens, doing the things necessary to get an idea of what we're dealing with. If your eyes are like mine, the picture in that telephone does wonderful things. I take that snapshot, but then I get to spread that thing nice and wide to take a look. If you bring it into my office, guess what we get to do? We get to put it underneath the microscope up in the office and throw it over on the computer screen, and then we can blow it up to what we're looking at right now. And we have that opportunity to see really what's there, piercing and sucking the sap out of the plant, or more importantly, transmitting the disease from one plant to the next. And we have a better idea of dealing with things. My example on this particular slide here, can anybody tell me what I have right here? Not tent caterpillar. This is a tiny little strawberry plant. Spider mites. Spider mites are not actually insects. They're not six-legged little creatures. What are they? They're in the arachnid family. They've got 8 legs, right? The sprays that I would normally spray on insects to kill an insect, in many cases will do away with their predators. And what's resulting then is a flare or an increase in mites, whether it be spider mites or two-spotted mite and things of that nature. In many cases, even on my organic, these are, what's this right here? What's that insect right there? Those are my aphids. Aphids come in all different colors. In Floyd County, lots of us deal with the little black aphids because those are white pine aphid. And white pine aphid tend to feed on our Christmas tree heritage that's been planted here for years and years and years. But the little green melon aphids the little green aphids and or the melon aphids that are kind of rose-colored, rosy aphid for its name, they come in different colors, but they all look like these little fat sap suckers, and they usually have two little tailpipes right out the back that help us identify that particular insect. Lots of us will jump in a conventional growing situation. I have some big boys of insecticides to deal with this. Fact of the matter is, from a homeowner's perspective, I could be just as successful with a little bit of insecticidal soap. So a little non-ionic dishwashing detergent mixed with water, spray it down, and I have killed all the aphids on my plant and haven't even had to grab for the big boy of insecticide. At the same time, when these guys are feeding, they are feeding on usually those new shoots, those new green points where all our buds are breaking, our transplants, and they cause the distortion and the twisting and the unusual appearance, and we'll show that later on. But so we grab a chemical and we spray for those, and like I said, by spraying for that insect over there, in many cases I can have as few as 10 days later a flare of a much more difficult pest problem to deal with. So that's why it's important to understand life cycle and how we're going to deal with certain things. Once again, the whole purpose of that first 10-15 minutes that we talked about, do we even know the cause of the plant damage? Are we even dealing with the pest? Is it something that we created in the abiotic or that physiological side of things, and we're confusing that with an actual pest? So getting all the physiological disorders out of there and the deficiencies and the various other things, maybe it's pesticide damage from previous usage, improper planting. We have got to determine the cause, and the best way to do that is to identify what's going on. So, if I had to ask you in the audience and the television audience tonight, what is our insect pest in this particular slide right here? We have 3 interesting, quite interesting insects right up there. Any suggestions or ideas as to what we're looking at? Certainly we can guess this one right here, right? Lady beetle. Yes, ladybug, ladybird, whatever. Multiple names. We have about 5 different varieties in Southwest Virginia alone. So they come in different shapes, colors and sizes, spots, as that goes on. What do I have right here, number 2? Cabbage? Could work on cabbage. Yes, its larva could work on cabbage. It's not actually a moth. It's actually a butterfly. We can tell moths away from butterflies in that moths always have your filigree antennae, or your antenna that have the fuzzy antennae. Whenever you have a nice, straight, slick antenna up to the bulb, you're dealing with a butterfly. But here's the important thing to know about butterflies and moths. The adults, while they're out there feeding on nectar and other things, what do their babies tend to feed on? Plants, every time. They're caterpillars. Caterpillars are chewing insects. So just something to think about. Bring you right on down here to number 3. What is number 3? Any ideas? Do you know? I think you probably know. Yeah, it's not actually a pest. It is actually this one's baby. That is a baby lady beetle. And that particular stage, in its larval stage, of this insect up here, eats 10 times its body weight a day in aphids and helps to clean up your plants. So if I got out there and saw, oh, I've got these beautiful butterflies, but oh gosh, I got to spray those. Let me go out here and get the insecticide and start spraying away. I just sprayed the most beneficial life stage of the lady beetle. Now, she certainly eats aphids, even in her adult form, but her larval form goes to town. It might even be referred to as aphid lines, much like the lacewing and things. They just flat go to town, traveling that stem and eating aphids as they go. So understanding that, sometimes the prettiest of insect, it's the life stage. It's understanding that life cycle, that the moths and the butterflies in their larval form are caterpillars. Caterpillars in the garden are those things that notch and chew and create that type of damage on your leaves that you can identify as caterpillar damage every time. Notched, chewed on leaves and things, those are the ones that most every time are some type of larval pickle worm, cucurbit worm, diamondback moth larvae, whatever it may be. Let's do this one more time. Let's play right here, because sometimes Mother Nature really wants to mess with our heads. So I'm going to ask you again, which is the pest in this particular group of slides? 1, 2, or 3? And see, this is the wonderful thing about Meredith over there in Montgomery County. She's a very articulate young extension agent that likes to make sure you have some good information to take home. Can't hardly see the difference between 2 and 3?
No, I don't.
That's Mother Nature playing her role. And ding, 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 ding. We're very close. You are correct. It is a ladybird beetle. It's one of the variations that we don't readily have around here. It's a pest of our citrus crops and sagebrush and things further south in warmer regions. But actually, once again, it's a predator. It's an adult predator of other insects. And its baby, if you remember the baby on the other screen, actually is called the mealybug destroyer. It looks, right here is a mealybug. See the long fur, the long tails off the back and the little furs around? It looks like a mealybug, doesn't it? Mother Nature's disguised it very well. And as it's making its way up to a mass of mealybugs feeding on the stem of your young transplants, that mealybug destroyer is going to town, just like it normally would in its cousins in other areas. So once again, understanding that if I wanted, lots of times when I see that whitening mess up and down the stems, I usually am dealing with a mealybug or a woolly aphid or some of those insects that are really problems for plants. In many cases, there are those sprays and things that we'll have to talk about to deal with, and or how we fix the problem of their coating and covering. But this, once again, is the beneficial going after the true problem, which is mealybug. Some stages of the life cycle, insects are more protected than others. As usually in their youngest stages, that's where their protection is best provided by the parent insect. The only way to really start telling what insects are present and stuff is doing something to really monitor or capture or locate. If I had to ask you what type of insects crawl around this room at night, where would you and I go to take a quick look to see what insects were probably here last night? The lights, the windows, those things that attract the insects at night. Most of our garden feeders, in fact, most all of your caterpillars, short of the tomato hornworm, who had the tomato hornworm? There you go. Most of them are very hidden during the day and feed at night and are attracted by light stuff. But if I go right over here to the windowsill, I can tell you what's been coming in and crawling around and usually occupying the space during the day. And at the night, after they've tried to escape back out from being drawn in from the light, I can find them on the windowsill. Same things in the garden. I can buy, this is actually a greenhouse, but I have sticky trap extended all the way across the tops of each of those rows and stuff there. In greenhouses, that's pretty easy to do. I can stick those things out, but I can do the exact same thing, in a garden situation if I'm looking to monitor maybe what is making its way towards my little piece of heaven that I'm trying to take care of. So in many cases, you can order online, you can order from lots of different places. Seven Springs probably has sticky traps and sticky cards available in their catalog for order right here in Floyd County. But in most cases, the yellow and the blue are two types of sticky card that when you clothespin them out there or put them in a garden location, it gives us the opportunity as you walk into the garden that day, let's go maybe check my card and let's see what kind of insects have made their way in my direction. Maybe if I can see that I've got a problem here on this card, they've been attracted to this, it's only a matter of time till they get over here. Then I'm going to have to adjust my decision making at that point. Proper equipment's nice for ID because, once again, my eyes are not what they used to be. I love to get them underneath the microscope where I can blow them up and see what I'm dealing with. So all of it, though, comes back to that monitoring or that scouting process. We have to recognize the threshold. There's two types of threshold. There's the economic threshold. That's when it's going to cost us our pocketbook or our wallet. That's when they've done enough damage to our plants, I'm having to buy new plants, okay? I don't want to get once I get to that threshold is when I absolutely want to do something to deal with that particular pest. Now, there's also the aesthetic threshold. Now, unless I'm the president of the university or the like, and my wife steps out and says, "Oh, this looks terrible on my roses and the like. I want something sprayed. I want spray today." Yes, we go out there and we spray today. But that's the aesthetic threshold. If I'm not causing a problem or an overall damage to the plant just yet, or if I'm not resulting to the point where I'm looking at replacement or cost, I need to think about insects tend to build in population. If I took time not to spray them while they're small, to where they start eating little bits like candy and becoming resistant to things. But if I gave them an opportunity to kind of get up there, on up in their population, and then I hit them with some soapy water, or I hit them with an insecticide of choice, then I'm knocking an entire population that might not rebound for the entire year. So understanding that we have some thresholds and some goals to take and decide as to when we need to actually take action. When it comes to understanding your thresholds, we need to know at what point is the non-return going to step in there and become a problem for us. At what point is it no longer just a nuisance, but maybe it's becoming a health hazard or like I said, the economic threat to our wallet. At those points, we really want to deal with things. But understand that the thresholds are actually different for different insects. What's that bad boy right there? Tomato hornworm, tobacco hornworm, all the common names, thanks to what the leaf has got it covered up right there, but it's a nice little red horn right there. But the potential for one of those to exist in the garden is maybe 2 tomato plants a night, or by the next day, they are really defoliated. They're eating their weight in leaf material right off your plants. So the threshold for one of them is when I see it, I'm pulling it. I'm going to squash it. The threshold for spider mites or aphids are really, it may be the stage of the plant. Can my plant or can my tree tolerate some presence here? In many cases, they do. Trees work through all the time, certain insect presence. But in the case of young growing plants early in the garden season, something like this, the proliferation of that insect is really noticeable from standing at arm's length. I don't need the lens to see something's going on. That's a threshold, okay? At that point, on a 70-degree week, every individual insect right there is reproducing about 200 babies every 6 days. The mites have that same ability for proliferation. So let's talk about our controls. First, if we were in closed systems like greenhouses, it's much easier to tackle the cultural things that you and I can do. Because we could shut the doors and the windows as long as we can regulate the temperatures inside, and I can deal with anything in a closed space. So from a cultural control, that's much easily done in a greenhouse type situation. But out in the garden, out in the landscape, there are those things that I can reduce the pest population, or at least possibly watch their introduction into my area, the sticky cards. Maybe I've got a buffer zone of marigolds out and around the garden and things. Maybe I've got these deterrent locations so that I can actually see the insects spread to those areas first. Maybe it's me just being knowledgeable enough to understand that when I mow the grass around the garden, where does all the insects go that are down in the grass? Into the garden. They want to find their way to security and to safety. They're going to move from that area into the area where I'm trying to grow. So understanding culturally, those things that you and I can do differently to achieve the change, that's what we'd like to accomplish. Sanitation is everything. If you're growing organically or you want to grow with as few chemicals as possible, sanitation is everything. Rot, decay, decomposition, all these things that are happening, or a sick plant that is over here is occurring from a disease. Yank it, get it out. The sanitation, its removal will reduce the chances for spread and production over the rest of your growing space. Disinfection would be the other suggested big one in terms, you can see I'm not very disinfected over there right now, but the fact of the matter is that 10% Clorox solution for my containers or my garden appliance, whatever I'm working through the garden, maybe before that particular implement gets drug out of the field over here or was used on such and such location, is brought to my location to be reused, maybe it just simply gets hosed off or cleaned up before it has a chance to deposit all those weed seeds in my new garden row. So just thinking about those things that you and I can do differently. Then we jump into the biological controls. These are where we're using Mother Nature as the natural enemy for these pests that we're trying to deal with. And in many cases, I'm talking about the introduction of a predator insect, or it could be biological controls. It may be using a sex insect, it's sex pheromone. It's sense to actually attract other insects in, at which point I know I have 12 days or 14 days of mating that will occur before they will actually start laying eggs, and then I have 7 days after that, and then so 22 days, 23 days later, that's when I need to spray. It's understanding that I have all these tools that I can use if I'm good enough or educated enough about recognizing what's available. We'll talk about several of these here in just a minute. But moving right along, I finished the other tools or techniques. Mechanical. Anytime we're using some type of device or mechanism or anything mechanically to reduce our problems. Absolutely, in many cases, if I'm experiencing or due to experience an insect presence or a pest situation, I can get out there in some cases and cover with remay and protect my crops in that fashion. In the case of the cicadas, they jumped on everybody's television. Oh, we're talking about the cicada and the mass of 2 emergence broods and blah, 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 blah. Hooey, hooey, hooey. We've already just watched our broods a few years ago. So all that, blow on television resulted in, thankfully, no cicadas in our area. But if I was going to try to protect a young apple orchard, is it going to help me to cover up the trees down to the ground like that? No. All my cicadas are emerging right up out of the soil and filling my tents full of insects. So just understand that whatever our mechanical method of choice may be, we have to understand how that insect and in its stage of life cycle is going to present itself as a problem. We'll get off of mechanical control. Chemical control real quick. Last resort. I tell folks from a conventional perspective every day on how to use the best controlling pesticides available to us. And at the same time, from an organic perspective, I talk about the best organic chemicals because they're still the same product, not the same products, but they are chemicals within my growing area. And yes, they may be safer, they may be naturally derived. Does that make it? Does an organic chemical always safer than any other chemical? No. You take, for instance, rotenone. I mean, it was originally on the organic lists and stuff, but it is just as dangerous a chemical. If I want to add a little bit to a fish pond to get rid of ick and destroy the fish population, they'll all float to the top in the matter of the first 24 hours. So recognizing that any chemical in excess can be too much, and I want to use chemicals as my last resort. So this slide is thrown in there to remind you chemical control is your last resort. This is one I'd like to stress to everybody. If you don't have one of these little pocket deals, tell me, I'll get you some. Just about every ag agency in the world has these little have these little notepads that fit in our pockets. Work well in purses too. But nothing helps us more than understanding what occurred this year or last year in anticipation of when it's going to occur again the following season. So if I do nothing more this year as I go into the garden each time, if I do nothing more than write down what I see, what I encountered, when that pest became available, so that I have the date and what its presence and stuff was, maybe how I dealt with it, I can then start to accumulate the actual calendar of when that insect or that pest is going to be my problem child to deal with the following year. Okay. Let's talk about some common insect pests. That's what we've been getting ready for. The big one in the back was the aphids. I talked about as of 2 weeks ago. The aphids were going gangbusters in Floyd County. We started in those 64, 65 degree afternoons. As soon as we got there, I was starting to see aphid issues jump out everywhere. And aphids are unique. They don't necessarily, one aphid doesn't like everything out there. They're kind of prone to their flavor of Kool-Aid. So depending on what aphid is there, it's usually dependent on that crop that's being grown or a family of plant that is being grown. But in every case, they can be different types of colors. They have a piercing, sucking mouth part. They're sticking that McDonald's straw into your plant, and they're sucking out the nutrients and the turgor pressure, the water and everything out of that stem that would normally be helping that leaf develop. So that leaf starts to twist and starts to gnarl. Your bud end starts to get all all misshapen or distorted. That's usually the sign of piercing, sucking insects that are systemically stealing the liquid out of your plant. Once again, like I've mentioned, the parthenogenesis, or the asexual ability for these insects to reproduce, not needing male or female. They can actually give birth to pregnant females right out of the bat. But like I said, during 70-degree weeks, these temperatures and the window of opportunity is such that that insect can then start reproducing every 6 days and recreate new and expansive levels of pests that are piercing and sucking your plant. They molt and they actually transition from their life cycle, but they look the same as they kind of go up through. They just lose their exoskeleton, kind of like a small crab or whatever, and crawl out and grow again, just at a larger point. And the cool thing about it is, I don't need a lot of effort or work to deal with the aphids if I recognized or I've gone out there and monitored the situation. If I see them out there, spray them down with a water hose. Then add a little insecticidal soap. I don't care if you mix your own. If you use a non-ionic detergent, dish detergent, 3/4 teaspoon of dish detergent and a pint of water, you basically you created your own insecticidal soap that you'd pay $11 for at the hardware store. Yes. Yes. In many cases, I want a dish soap that is not. It's going to be free of perfumes and not have. I don't necessarily want all the blue color of my Dawn. Now, I know for a fact I've used my Dawn. I'm not trying to suggest one company's name or another, but in all cases, like an Ivory and many of these are non-ionic anyway. They're designed to help remove dirt by changing ion exchange to help remove dirt off dishes. So in many cases, I'm dealing with that non-ionic product, but I don't want to have the perfumes and the colorants and the other things like that necessarily sprayed on my plants. So if I can choose just the cheapy bottle of the clear or the white, usually that will do the job just fine. Or I can go out and spend, $8 to $12 on a little small sprayer of insecticidal soap. But like I said, it's much easier to make a little bit if you want to try. We have here the predator feeding on them left and right. Yes.
When you spray them off with just the water, does that kill them, or just knocking them off?
It's just knocking them off the plant. In some cases, though, it will kill some. It's amazing what a droplet of water, a rain droplet hitting an ant or an aphid, can be a destructive thing. So yes, any level of pressure, you're probably working them over. But in every case, a soapy water over that plant then puts a residual soap layer that as they try to pierce and suck back through, you usually can do them in or contact. If it's over top of them, ideally, that contact over them is working the fatty acids and things in the soap itself are coating their exoskeleton. They can't breathe like they should, and you'll do the insect in. These right here, this little guy right up here, this is a parasitic wasp. He is out there looking for aphids in which to lay eggs in or parasitize. And as he does his job or she does her job well, the aphids will start to change to an off color, and out will crawl a new wasp eventually, or a new larvae, and everything will repeat the process. This is insects, the wasp working on aphids and gall midge. Over here we have mama and kiddo going to town right there. If you can see the white exoskeletons here, that is the aphid that has transitioned from 10-year-old to 11-year-old, whatever, from its stage, its life stage. That's the exoskeleton that's leaving behind. So if you see these little white crusty looking pieces of salt on the plant, lots of times that could be your exoskeleton where that insect has backed itself out and moved up to its next larger stage. Spider mites, extremely small. What oftentimes helps in their identification is seeing that webbing on your plant. Usually when I see the webbing and stuff, it's like, let's get this one in the microscope because I got something to show you here in just a minute. And as soon as I throw it underneath the microscope and turn the lights on or it warms up, I get creepy crawlies everywhere. But once again, mites in general are not insects. They are arachnids like spiders. They have 8 legs, and they are more difficult to control chemically than what an insect would be. And in fact, if I throw insecticide at that particular problem, in many cases, I'm not doing any good whatsoever in its control. Now, it's not to say that miticides won't necessarily work as an insecticide. In many cases, they do. Something that will kill a mite will absolutely kill an insect. But here's the problem. Miticides and that entire industry are dealing with a little pest here that has a resiliency in its ability to become resistant to spray. What can be sprayed one year, if repeated just a couple times, can be something that they'll eat like candy the following season, and I have no control for. So we've seen many and many more miticides removed from the regular homeowner market. For you to be able to walk down the store aisles at your big box store or your local hardware stores and things and pull a miticide off the shelf has become a difficult process. And it's because even the chemical companies recognize that the misuse of this product can result in resistant populations that can hurt us even on the commercial level. So they're taking those things kind of away from the average Joe Blow homeowner and making sure that the ones that are remaining, certainly that are advertised to do the job, are something that can tolerate potential misuse or whatever a little better, I guess, a better way of explaining it. The fact of the matter is, I can treat and control mites once again with something as simple as an insecticidal soap in some cases. I can have predatory mites. That's what this guy is right here. This guy with the nice big long legs, he's a mite. He's a predatory mite. He can cover twice the ground at the speed than the little guys. He's gobbling up and feeding on them just as effectively as an insecticide. When I see mite damage, and when you see your mite damage in your plants or on your young plants typically, but it could be later on in the season, say mid-June, prior to going into July, I see a lot of mite damage starting to hot, dry weather initially. That's where they've built an abundance, and I start to see the stippling or the feeding all over the leaf. The leaf itself might even start to take on kind of a silvery shine or a bronzing over that leaf, where so much insect or so much mite feeding underneath the leaf has been sucking and piercing. It literally creates a stippling effect on the leaf itself, a sheen. When I can see that type of damage, and I can see the white sheen on top and stuff from the feeding below, I know I've got a mite issue, and I know I should at that point recognize that I can't just grab an insecticide to do the job. I've got to make sure, hopefully to identify it. Let's bring it in the extension office. I'll identify it for you. Otherwise, we'll try to identify what you got going on so that you can make a proper decision on what to use. The mites, much like, well, jumping ahead there, the mites, much like the aphids, have that ability of being very progressive and pushing out huge populations in short periods of time.